It's our final panel of this year's event, and I think they've scheduled this at the end to keep us all waiting for it, because it's going to be a deep dive into the possibilities and policy implications of a future in which space technology will play an ever more important role. All our panellists are drawn from defence and industry on both sides of the Atlantic, of course, and we hope they're going to share their different perspectives on what opportunities they see in the space sector and how we seize them. It's such a wide topic that we have allowed a bit of extra time for this discussion, and this is definitely one where we're welcoming your questions if you're watching online. So please don't hesitate to send them in through the online platform, and we'll get them sent to me so I can put it to our panellists. Let me introduce the panel. I'm joined on stage by Commodore Jules Ball, the Head of Defence Space Capability in the newly formed Space Directorate at the Ministry of Defence, who's charged with directing and cohering pan-defence space ambition. From Lockheed Martin Space, I'm joined by Nick Smith, who's the Regional Director for UK and Europe. Prior to joining Lockheed Martin, Nick had served for 16 years in the Royal Air Force. We're also joined here by Ian Annett, the Deputy CEO for Project Delivery at the UK Space Agency. Prior to this, he was the Assistant Chief of Staff for Information Warfare and Chief Information Officer for the Royal Navy. I'm also joined by David Williams, the Chief Executive at Arkit, a quantum encryption company. He served as founder chairman of the advisory board of Seraphim Space Ventures, a technology venture capital firm. And I'm delighted to welcome our other panelists. The first is Lieutenant General William Licori, who joins us today from the Pentagon. He's the Deputy Chief of Space Operations, Strategy, Plans, Programs, Requirements and Analysis at the United States Space Force. Welcome. And finally, we're joined by Christina Riley, the Vice President of Commercial PNT, that's Positioning, Navigation and Timing at Satellas, which specialises in so-called LEO, Low Earth Orbit satellite technology. Welcome, Christina. Welcome to you all. My first question is actually going to be to Nick Smith from Lockheed Martin, because of course we had the news about the OSIRIS-REx probe scooping up potentially a bit of soil from the asteroid Bennu. Can you tell us anything more about it?
Thanks, Samira. And firstly, thank you, First Sea Lord, and for the organisers for the invitation and the chance to participate today. A great way for us to start this panel, actually. It's a really fantastic story for Lockheed Martin and their NASA teammates in the successful mission, the OSIRIS-REx mission. It's been a long mission. It's been over 4 years in transit to try and get to Bennu to do the collection of sample. It did its successful touch and go maneuver, where it got very close. It did a proximity operation, got very close to the asteroid, collected the sample, and is now able to return that sample a long transit back home for us to learn a little bit more about the universe, which is, of course, one of the great things about space exploration and these kinds of missions. It allows us to learn a bit more about ourselves and where we come from. So, yeah, fantastic news for us.
And we all know from the cinema that asteroids can be a threat in themselves, of course. We shall find out. Right, let's dive into talking about the future of the space in thinking about defence. And I wanted to ask Commodore Jules Ball first. Can you tell us a bit about how space will play a central role in defending national security?
Thanks, Samira. I suppose my first observation would be that the question you just posed is looking to the future. And I would argue that already space is underpinning hundreds of billions of global, of national economy. And so we need to be able to protect and defend those assets that are in space right now. To use a familiar analogy, I'll use this magnificent vessel that we're sitting on right now. This is a multi-billion pound capability. We wouldn't dream of setting the Queen Elizabeth to sea without being able to protect and defend it. We'd want to surveil the oceans. We'd want to command it. We'd want to be able to control it and the assets around it. And so if you look up in space at that critical national infrastructure, those billions of pounds, those billions of dollars that exist in space, why would I not wish to use the same methodology to protect and defend those space assets today and in the future?
Fantastic, thank you. General Licori, Lieutenant General Licori, could you give us an insight into the way the US military is structuring itself to address the increasing importance of space? Obviously, the creation of the Space Force has raised great interest.
Sure, absolutely. First of all, thank you, Samira, and to the organizers and the United Kingdom Ministry of Defense for the invitation to participate with such an august panel on a critically important and exciting topic. I will say I wish I could be there on the ship with you as opposed to in my office at the Pentagon, but I suppose the virtual world is what we're left with these days in the pandemic, but we'll take advantage of that for today. So again, great question on how we're organizing. So as Commodore Ball just highlighted, the critical importance of space isn't just the future, it's where we are today. And so in our country, we certainly have defined a vital national interest in the space domain. And the way we define that is freedom to operate and unfettered access in the domain in order to advance our national security, economic prosperity, and scientific knowledge of the nation. And so one of the ways that the United States has decided to do that is to establish our first new military service in 72 years, the United States Space Force, of which I'm a part. And so that service we are in place to meet three cornerstone responsibilities. Number one, to preserve freedom of operation in the domain. Number two, to enable joint lethality and effectiveness of our joint force and our allied forces. And number three, to provide independent options for our national decision makers. The way that we are going to be structured is somewhat different than many of our sister services. We certainly will be the smallest of the services, with a projected end strength somewhere around 16,000 personnel. That'll be divided amongst a space staff here at the Pentagon and three field commands separately focused on operations, acquisition, and then training and readiness. Now, I'll take the staff for a second. We certainly will be smaller than our counterparts here in the Pentagon. Our Chief of Space Operations, General Raymond, has said we'll do this with 600 or less personnel here at the Pentagon. The way we are structured at the headquarters here, we have the Chief, obviously, and our Vice Chief of Space Operations, General Thompson, and then 4 deputies underneath them, myself being one focused on strategy and resourcing, another deputy focused on operations, a third one focused on the human capital and personnel side of things, and then a fourth one focused on technology and innovation. And joining us on the leadership team at the Space Staff will be a director of staff, as well as Chief Master Sergeant Roger Toberman, who is General Raymond's senior enlisted advisor. And so that's how we'll be structured here at the Pentagon. We'll have 3 field commands, as I alluded to earlier. The difference there, again, because we're going to be a lean and agile service, we've had to streamline certainly from what we would have known in our time as a part of the Air Force. So in the Air Force, we talked about 5 echelons of command that we had, starting with a numbered Air Force, moving down to a major command, and then a wing, a group, and a squadron. So those 5 levels were the Air Force. In the Space Force, we're going to streamline that down to 3. And so the first level will be those 3 field commands. And underneath those field commands, we will have deltas, which will be our 06 or colonel level command will be deltas, and then underneath those deltas will be squadrons. So streamlining from 5 to 3 echelons of command is critically important to us being successful as we move forward here in the service. The last thing I would highlight is that because of the small numbers, we are absolutely going to have to define new ways of doing business, and that's some of the work that is ongoing right now, and that involves not only leveraging technology to the maximum extent possible. As a matter of fact, one of Chief Raymond's critical priorities for us moving forward is to make sure that we are a digital service from the very beginning, but also we'll need to streamline our processes. We will not have the numbers of personnel to be able to do things the way we've always done them, and so it's exciting opportunities for us, but that's just a small look at how we're organizing here in the United States military, specifically the U.S. Space Force.
Thank you. That was really helpful. And we're definitely going to come on to talk about the practical ways in which the military works with industry to achieve all the kind of exciting opportunities that you described. But I do have one more specific question, which is a military focus. I'll ask the Commodore first, and then I'll come back to you, Lieutenant General Likori. But space, we now know, is a contested domain in terms of potential use for warfare. There is a lack of international rules. There is a lack of international policies to protect against these threats. And I wanted to ask both of you how the defence sector here in the UK as well as in the US could work together to strengthen deterrence against hostile actors in space. Commodore first.
Thanks very much, Samira. I suppose my first point would be it's absolutely about relationships. It's not lost on me that amongst this small group that we have here, and I include General Bill here, who I know well, and I've met General Bill 3, 4, 5 times in the last 18 months. I liaise frequently with Ian, 2 to my left, in the UK Space Agency, the relationships across government. I've met Nick a number of times representing industry and the primes, and yesterday I was involved with a number of the people that work with David. The point is, there's a relationship piece here across the sector that's not just the defence sector, but across the space sector on both sides of the Atlantic. So getting a common goal, getting a common narrative, getting a common rhetoric is crucial to our way forwards. I would also highlight that more formally than that, and certainly looking through a pure defence lens, you may be familiar with the Combined Space Operations Initiative, and this is an initiative effectively amongst the Five Eyes partners, plus France and Germany, to try to improve our multinational space collaboration and coordination through a policy lens, through an operations lens, and through a capability development lens, so that we're speaking the same language with the same ambition and the same intent. And of course, to operationalise that, the UK was the first coalition partner to sign up with the United States Operation Olympic Defender in 2018. So we're making tangible steps forwards to enable the conduct of combined space operations in the future. So in sum, it's a whole force effort. It's a transatlantic and coalition effort. It's across defence, across all of the domains in the UK, and it's across industry and across Whitehall as well.
Thank you. Lieutenant General Likori, could you give us the American perspective on this concern?
Sure. I'll start by saying I couldn't say it any better than what my counterpart Jules there has mentioned. Relationships, it starts there. Our chief has regularly said the United States is certainly not going to go it alone in the space domain. All the way up to our national security strategy and national defense strategy, we talk about the criticality of partnerships, making us stronger in each of the domains. Jules did a great job of covering the Combined Space Operations Forum, which has been a huge success for our various nations. He talked about the different lenses through which we look at issues. I think as important to those individual lenses of ops, policy, and capabilities is just the opportunity to get together either in the same room or virtually and share a discussion about what we perceive to be going on in the domain, how certain countries have created it as a warfighting domain, and the importance of us sharing a discussion so that when there are activities that go on that would fall into the irresponsible behavior, that we can together, not as one country, but as multiple countries, come online and talk about the problems that creates in the domain. I'll pivot from there to the other piece of partnerships, and that is just as Jules said, I have counterparts in the United States industry equivalent to those on the stage and the rest on the panel that we meet with on a regular basis. If I look at Vandenberg Air Force Base in Southern California is where our Combined Space Operations Center is. So not only do we have allied partners that work on the operations floor side by side with our U.S. personnel, but we also have industry who work there now as well. One of the things that we've done partnering with industry and our allies is to find opportunities to get together for war games focused on the space domain and to try things out and to explore how to react to different situations in the domain. one of the things that happened several years ago is we decided to try out a commercial integration cell, if you will, which brought some industry partners into the war game, because the reality is all of us operate in the same domain and we face the same threats. And so we brought them in to do shared awareness and then find potential partnering opportunities based on how the game evolved. That worked out so well that then Lieutenant General Raymond, who was the Combined Forces Space Component Commander at Vandenberg, he role-played himself in the war game. And then when he returned to Vandenberg Air Force Base and a particular situation was happening, he turned to his leadership team and he said, bring the commercial integration cell lead so that we can talk about this. And they said, well, sir, we don't actually have one. That was just in the game. Well, you can imagine that it didn't take long to create an actual commercial integration cell. And we have several industry partners that, again, are there at the operations floor engaging directly with our military space professionals and our allies. It's those types of opportunities, both in a war game environment and in the real world environment, where we can work together to ensure that we're doing the best things for the domain.
Fascinating, and really helps us now because we're going to open up to bring in kind of civilian and commercial partners into this discussion. Ian Annett of the UK Space Agency. So traditional space activities are obviously being revolutionised. We've got kind of new and kind of complex legal issues now cropping up. And I wonder if you could give us an insight into how space law and regulation should be adapting to this kind of commercial age and its challenges.
Thanks, Samira. So the discussion to date has focused predominantly on the security aspects of space, but clearly it has a role to play in not only security but also prosperity, as well as stability. And you've got to allow operators, be they commercial or others, to live alongside each other in what's the 1967 Outer Space Treaty described as, of course, a global common for the peaceful use of all mankind. Now, we've come a long way from 1967 and the regulations that were set out then.
Can I just ask you to clarify, because I remember studying that at school and thinking I thought that was supposed to mean that we don't have warfare in outer space.
Yeah,
so how come we have a need to reassess law?
So that's probably a question best asked from a military man.
Okay.
But what I would say, of course, the lines then become more blurred. If you're going to defend yourself rather than actually conducting operations in space, there are other actors from other nations who take a different interpretation of that, and then how they operate within the domain of space as well as through the domain of space. So in order to address such things, then we need to make sure that our regulations are appropriate for modern usage, whether it be security or prosperity or otherwise. And just to give a little bit of insight in that, of course, there are 4,000 satellites in space. About 3,000 of those are dead at the moment, but then there are upwards of 20,000 artifacts that could be tracked, maybe many more than that. And on a regular basis, there are what known as conjunctions, so potential collisions between items in space. So the regulations now have to try and make sure that we can avoid that for the protection of space in the future and the use of space in the future. From a UK perspective, we had the 1986 Space Act that allowed us to launch and operate safely in space, and now we've updated that just in 2018 with the Space Industry Act, and we've got some legislation currently going through Parliament that will build upon that. Why do we need that? If you look at the proliferation, so in just the last few years, the proliferation of small sats alone into low Earth orbit, 400 last year, that represented 80% of all satellites going into space, which is a complete switch around from what it was just 3 or 4 years ago. If you look at those who want to invest in space, particularly small sats as well, where a lot of people, I think it was a 26% increase of venture capitalists just over the last year or so. So there's a massive interest. So we've got to be able to protect this, as I say, from both a commercial aspect as well as a security aspect. The regulations that we put in place should allow for that. They start looking at risk assessments. Until now, many European countries would say that, okay, a company would have to insure up to 60 million euros for launch. The UK is proposing taking a slightly different approach based on a insurance risk assessment. And that makes it more accessible, whether you're in academia, whether you're in industry, or indeed if you're in government. Makes it more accessible, affordable, and more appropriate. But alongside those regulations is about having the ability to deorbit. So if you're going to put something into space and it's going to be above the International Space Station, you want to make sure that they can guarantee that they can deorbit it safely. UK is a good place to have those regulations. We've got a stable legal framework within which we operate. And again, with these new regulations that we're hoping to push through Parliament, then I think we'll find that will be a very attractive to people coming into the UK to operate from space, but also helps from international perspective to set new standards, and hopefully others will follow those standards.
Thank you. Well, I want to bring in Christina Riley now, because talking about satellites, we know that the emerging economy of autonomous vehicles and modern day defence technologies depends very much on a satellite infrastructure to operate. So could I ask you how we can harness space technology to protect our critical national infrastructure?
Yes, thank you. So in addition to autonomous vehicles and defense, there's many forms of critical infrastructure, such as communications, transportation systems, the electrical grid, a whole host of essential utilities that rely on GNSS to operate safely and reliably. A great example that we can all relate to are telecom markets. Every one of us keeps a smartphone in our pocket. Every cell phone tower, though, relies on very precise time synchronization in order to operate. So as 4G moves to 5G, the timing precision becomes even more important. And I don't know if you know, but 4G networks require a timing accuracy of something like 1.5 microseconds, but 5G will require timing synchronization as precise as 240 nanoseconds. So the good news is there's a solution that's also space-based, and because of the proximity to Earth, Earth orbit, which we call LEO, as you guys all know, those satellites provide a great alternative for PNT, as they're 25 times closer to Earth. So two of the biggest benefits, they're stronger and they have a more secure signal. So those are two of the issues that we look at most. So because LEO satellites are closer to the Earth, the signal's 30 dB stronger. It's 1,000 times stronger than what we rely on with GPS today. So it can penetrate indoors where GNSS cannot, and it's impervious to spoofing. So we can protect our critical infrastructure from deliberate attacks as well.
Thank you. David Williams, I have a similar question for you. Your expertise is in cybersecurity in particular. Could you explain how you're using space technology to defend and protect critical pieces of national infrastructure?
Sure. Well, my company's been in stealth mode for 3 years because we've invented a set of technologies which solve all of the known problems of quantum cryptography. We'll be revealing that next year. There's perhaps 2 companies in this room that have had a briefing, but most of the world doesn't know about it. But it's generally true that satellite systems have a very important role to play in distributing cryptographic solutions globally. In the future, particularly when we're addressing the quantum internet, there are things that satellites can do that you simply can't do across fiber optic cables.
Could you give an example of something that you could only do via satellite?
If we're talking about quantum information cannot be transmitted at long distance over fiber optic cables. Right, it can only be sent at long distance by satellite. And there are many problems with those concepts, which my company has solved. But I think the bigger picture for space is that space has changed. I was the first British entrepreneur ever to launch a geostationary satellite, and that was 10 years ago. Since then, there are dozens of British space entrepreneurs now trying to launch or already have launched small satellites. And the great flourishing of innovation that's happening in the private sector means that things are happening at pace. And I think most of the threats that the people in this room are now confronting are threats that are developing and emerging at pace. And only by harnessing the power of the private sector to innovate at pace are governments going to be able to come up with solutions to the kind of attacks that our adversaries are going to be bringing us in the next 5 years, of which, in my opinion, quantum threat is number one.
Thank you. I want to put my next question to Nick Smith, and it's actually picking up from something both Commodore Ball and Lieutenant General Likori were talking about, which is the importance of the kind of public-private sector partnership. So how can the UK and the US and public-private sector forge greater partnerships, develop new space technologies to tackle some of the really serious global issues that are absolutely about threatening our security, so space debris, natural disasters, climate change?
I think a lot of these are going to take technology, and a lot of that technology will still come from the private sector, from the industrial base. And what I would say from the outset is those issues you've talked about are as important to us as industry users of space, and we've heard about some of the commercial applications of space. So it's very important for us to make sure that space remains a sustainable place. So we're just invested in making sure that happens. With some of those issues, clearly there'll be times when actually it's within industry's best interest to go and try and help resolve those issues. But sometimes it's not always, or the commercial application or the commercial benefit of those is not always applicable. And that's where government and industry can work together to try and find the best way to tackle these. Now, over time, as some of these issues become greater, and there are more commercial utilization of space, so when we start thinking about potentially mining, asteroid mining, manufacturing, then there will be stronger commercial drivers to make sure that the right things are done in space. But until that happens, that's a really key area where I think both government and industry can work together to make sure the right solutions are found. So I think that's the starting point. One thing I would say though is space as a global commons is probably the place where that kind of collaboration works best. I think it has always been an area of significant collaboration, both internationally and between the private and public sector. So I think if it's going to get cracked anywhere, my view is, and I'm probably suffering from the optimism bias that Angus Lapsley mentioned yesterday, but I think space is one of those domains where it can be done.
Thank you. Can I bring in Lieutenant General Licori on this? I'm quite interested in how you see that kind of commercial defence partnership when we're talking about threats, which are definitely threats to security, things like climate change, things like space debris, and natural disasters.
Sure. Thank you very much. And I would echo much of what Nick just said. We certainly are only able to develop the capabilities that we have that we will operate in the United States Space Force through wonderful partnerships with all of our industry partners who have been doing this for many, many, many years, forging new ground in technology and those types of things. I alluded to earlier our commercial integration cell at Vandenberg Air Force Base. That's one example. Another example where we do this is at our relatively new National Space Defense Center out at Schriever Air Force Base in East Colorado Springs. There's a team of operators that are paying attention to things that are going on in the domain. From a space domain awareness perspective, Commodore Ball talked about he used his metaphor of the Queen Elizabeth there, and if you were to use her out in warfare, you need to have domain awareness. That is no different in the space domain, as he alluded to. Much of the space domain awareness data that our operators are looking at these days come from new technologies and come directly from commercial companies that have put capability on orbit or on the ground that we're able to leverage. So another example there of the close partnership that has to happen just in one other mission area, one that's critical, as countries look to develop capabilities to counter the benefits that all of us get from the space domain. We've got to be much more informed about what's going on in the domain next to satellites that are performing vital missions. And so bringing new technology online for the domain awareness mission is another piece of that.
Thank you. And same question to Commodore Ball.
Thank you. I suppose I was just going to capitalise on one comment that the General just made, and it's about the dual-use nature of the space domain. Perhaps in the traditional domains, and forgive me for being basic, but a fast jet has lots of military utility. Perhaps its commercial sector utility is more limited. And you could say the same for a warship. You could say the same for a tank, if I'm being a little bit basic. My point with the space domain is that from a space defense perspective, my space domain awareness, the ability for me to look up and seek indications of nefarious activity, is Ian's observation to look for conjunction, to see whether civil and commercial satellites might hit or miss. My ISR, my intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance for defence, might be Earth observation for the commercial or the private sector, delivering benefit for natural disasters or looking at maritime water flows, etc., for peaceful use. So my point is that it is so clear to me, and it's such an exciting opportunity for the research and development communities, both in the defence and in the civil sector, on both sides of the Atlantic and across our allies and partners, to really take a whole force approach for the benefit of us all.
Thank you. Would anyone else on the panel like to contribute here? Is that, sorry, slight brain freeze. Is that David?
Yes.
Yes, David first, and then Ian. Go ahead.
Well, I think the big point here is that there is an enormous amount of innovation that we have to do at pace. And I borrow a phrase that I read in Jim Mattis's book over the summer about innovation at the speed of relevance. In space, the average lifetime of one of our space assets is perhaps 7 years. GEOs last 20 years and little satellites a year. So our space assets last a long time, and that's inconsistent with the rate at which technology is now developed. In Silicon Valley-style companies, technology revolutions are happening now every couple of years. So I think that a partnership between the private sector and the public sector is essential if, as British nationals, we are going to get the benefit of bleeding-edge technology international use. But I also think that space is such a big and expensive and complicated domain that if we're not focusing collaboration at a Five Eyes level, if we're not generating very rapid Five Eyes collaboration with bleeding-edge technology, our adversaries like China and Russia, who have much higher motivation to innovate quickly, will simply get ahead of us. And in all of the war games we've seen over the last 5 years, it's painfully obvious that whoever generates dominance in space wins. So the only way we're going to generate dominance in space is by collaborating at a Five Eyes level and by getting the fast-paced innovation of private companies into defence space as soon as possible.
Ian, and while you're I'm happy for you to pick up on David's points, I'd also like to kind of bring it back to address how far we can use commercial partnerships in space technology to tackle these big security issues like climate change, like space debris.
Yeah, so Jules was mentioning about the dual use of, so for example, Earth observation. One man's Earth observation satellite is another man's ISR satellite to another extent. But I think I'd like to just extend it a little bit further than just security as well. Space is a £15 billion economy for the UK. It's a $360 billion economy for the globe. That's not going to get any smaller. If you listen to Bryce reports, they'll say that's going to be $2 trillion by 2030. So there's also, from a commercial perspective, protecting your assets, protecting your investment. You know, all these venture capitalists, angel investors, and investment funds. So they need to come together, of course, to make sure that they're protected both for commercial aspects as well as they are for security aspects. All of the so many of the communication satellites do have dual use, so you'll find that they'll have government traffic as well as civilian traffic going across them as well. And again, so it's not just the security aspects, those same satellites need to be protected because it's an investment for others.
No, thank you for raising that issue. And Nick, did you want to add anything on this? And then I'm going to go to Christina.
I was just quickly going to just add, I mean, just specifically on the climate, I think the other thing is what I think we all recognise is that space is going to be a key part of actually driving some of these sustainability things on Earth. I think about 100% of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals are reliant on space services, and over 50% of the climate change markers and variables have to be measured from space. So clearly, sustainability in space is actual sustainability on Earth is reliant on sustainability in space. So we've all got to co-invest in this.
Absolutely. Christina Riley, if I may, I'd like to actually raise a different issue with you, which is we've seen increased incidences of security breaches around the world pertaining to global navigation satellite, and so much of our discussion at this forum has been about the growing threat of kind of cyber attack. What are the risks associated with these kinds of breaches, and how can we protect ourselves and our space technology?
Yeah, thank you. It is very important. We need to be vigilant about maintaining security for PNT. GPS and other GNSS are susceptible to spoofing, as I mentioned before. It's a situation where counterfeit signals override legitimate signals to deliver intentionally false time and location information to a user or an application, which can have devastating effects. So occurrences of spoofing are on the rise all over the world in the past couple of years. And unless civil government authorities and private sector get together, we really are going to face a much bigger issue. But together we can put these backups in place, and we can really prevent some of these devastating effects. So you guys have all heard of the studies conducted both in the UK and the US that cite billions of dollars or pounds our economies will lose as a result of even one day's outage. Having a backup GNSS is not enough. We need an alternative PNT that in itself is immune to spoofing. LEO PNTs offered by my company, for example, incorporate the latest cryptographic techniques that enable proof of location approach that neutralizes the threat of spoofing. So the good news is our service is available today and it's available worldwide. So it's really an option we can continue to utilize and to look into for those that have not yet.
Thank you so much. We've got some interesting questions coming in from the online audience. I thought I'd start bringing them in now, and to some extent, anyone can volunteer to answer them. So the first one is, I suppose, a scenario question. What sort of incident in space would have to take place to stop the information flowing that we rely on for our everyday lives? For example, GPS, traffic lights, timing devices. Yes, go ahead, Ian.
So I think the most likely cause is not one that's going to be in space. Though that traffic goes through space, most of the infrastructure is in the ground. And therefore, actually, what we need to be cognizant of is cyber attacks that happen within the ground-based infrastructure, the ground stations that actually service space as well. So kind of let's not just get too seduced about all of the stuff that's up there above the sky. It's got to be looking at the whole infrastructure and the whole system. And that goes back to Christina's point about moving out from just reliant on geostationary PNT or indeed just LEO PNT. It's how we build space as part of a system of systems with other technologies, whether they be terrestrial based or whether they be radio frequency based, to ensure that we can meet that demand signal for accurate position, navigation and timing, not simply from space but more broadly as well.
Yes, David, did you want to come in?
Sometimes in fora like these, I feel like the guys that were warning against the rise of Hitler in the 1930s. Quantum threat is around the corner. If you just read the announcements of the Chinese government this week, the possibility of our adversaries having quantum computers that can defeat the encryption that's used to protect all of our systems this decade, it's extremely likely. If you talk to the CEOs of the US hyperscale businesses and leaders of the services in the US, they will quietly concede that it's a this decade threat. If we're not across the threat, and if we're not deploying all of the possible scenarios at our disposal for mitigating that threat, then we run the risk of having the kind of calamity where the information stops to flow because we can no longer trust the infrastructure.
Would Commodore Ball, you'd like to have a word? And then I'll bring in Lieutenant General Licori after that.
Thank you. I suppose an example that we could conceivably consider is something in the kinetic domain, i.e. a weapon firing domain, at some point in the future. And where I take that is, although space is obviously an extraordinarily big place, the orbits that our capabilities are in are actually relatively fixed in a lot of areas. Once you conduct a weapon event, an anti-satellite test, for example, where you might explode a body that's on orbit, that in itself will create thousands more pieces of debris on orbit. And that poses a problem for everything else, which could cause further shock. And so you end up in a potential scenario where you could have this catalogue of events that perhaps have been originating from one single event. I have read, and I can't verify it, but I have read that half of the space debris that sits right now in low Earth orbit was actually caused by an anti-satellite missile test some years ago. And that's the fear that we live in for the future.
General Licori.
Sure. So I'd just like to pick up where the other panelists have discussed. Certainly, when it comes to all of us benefit from the space domain through data and information that comes to the ground through the electromagnetic spectrum. Certainly, the ground systems that process this data are also susceptible. And so from our perspective, a couple different things. One, we certainly trying to increase the resilience of the signals that are coming to the ground. For instance, as we bring on the next block of GPS satellites, those signals, we're looking for about an 8 times increase from jamming prevention or anti-jam capability. Another example I might add is that we've recently published Space Policy Directive 5 in the United States, which is focused on a whole of government framework for safeguarding space assets from a cyber perspective and critical infrastructure. It takes 3 lines of approach. One is modernization, so bringing online new capabilities, like some of your panelists on the stage have mentioned already today. The second line of effort would be in workforce investment. So in other words, increasing the digital fluency of our workforce, course, increasing awareness and fluency in capabilities that would allow us to protect the data and the networks that are out there. And then lastly, apropos to this panel, is expanding partnerships. Again, we certainly have no intent and cannot succeed on our own as the United States Space Force or the United States. And so partnering with our industrial partners and our allies in this area will be very beneficial to all of us.
Thank you. Quite a specific question next. A deterrence in a contested domain depends more on capabilities than relationships. Is the UK considering investing in anti-satellite ASAT capabilities, perhaps in collaboration with the US? I don't know who feels able to take this. Is this a question for the UK Space Agency at all? I don't know.
I think that's one for you, Jules.
Commodore Ball.
So I suppose it would be inappropriate for us to go into any detail on that type of capability, but I think there are a number of different routes that we can pursue. And part of it is the rhetoric, part of it is the narrative that we can play in concert with our allies and partners. Part of it is the narrative that we have developed and support the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office in order to make approaches to that soft power lens that hopefully can deliver effect through a common narrative amongst our allies and partners. I'll step away from going into any of the detail of the specific capabilities that we might wish to deploy, but the bottom line is that we are absolutely looking at a range of defence capabilities in partnership with the United States and the rest of the Five Eyes to make sure that we're coordinated, that we're coherent, that we're efficient and that we're effective.
One thing that's really emerged from our discussions, all of you have hinted at, I hesitate to use the phrase Wild West, but there is a sense that now space is open to, tiny rogue operators where it used to be only open to kind of the two main superpowers investing in a space race. And I wonder how concerned you are that even with all the efforts you've described about trying to develop international codes of law that are cohered to setting standards, you're dealing with a domain which is always going to be contested in an incredibly reckless way, and that, as we saw with examples of Chinese satellites, there was controversy about Elon Musk putting up thousands and thousands of them, and no one seemed to know until it broke in the news. What are your thoughts about how realistic it is to be able to maintain a kind of peace out there? Ian, do you want to take that first, and then David?
Just to give a little bit of reassurance, of course, there are around about 9 nations at the moment that can launch vehicles into space. And most of those, there might be some exceptions like the like of North Korea, will have a regulatory process which you need to abide by, and also goes back to the United Nations agreements in space. So for example, the previous question about anti-satellite weapons, so direct ascent ASATs and actually on-orbit ASATs are banned under UN conventions as well. We can't do that. The way to address those, of course, is actually by calling out bad behaviour at the UN or otherwise. It's actually by setting good behaviours. It's about having a strong regulatory framework which you can then demonstrate to the rest of the globe. And then it's a bit like smoking, you kind of name and shame. So that's the way to address these kind of threats, I think. Certainly from a regulatory perspective, is have strong, flexible regulatory frameworks, call out bad behaviour when you see it, but make sure that you can bring the rest of the globe with you by doing so. It
doesn't feel like shaming has as much power as it used to in the international domain, though, does it?
So the UN bodies that can be used, so there are some that are out there, the Worldwide Radio Conference, all of which, if you are going to be an operator in space, you still have to get authority to operate on a particular spectrum and also with a particular region within space. So unless you can get an operator to put something up there that has that agreement, it's going to be very difficult to do so.
David, you wanted to come in on this?
My answer's in two parts.
And then I'll bring in General Likuri.
Firstly, it's lovely to be sitting on this ship and to be able to say that this is one area in which Her Majesty's government actually does a really first-class job. One area where the British government's policy is great. We do apply the highest standards for how we allow companies to launch spacecraft and to do it safely. And so Britain is a leader in that field. But also, I mean, I've sat in ITU negotiations when I used to run a bigger satellite company where even the government of Iran followed the rules. So the rules-based system does work because it's a bit like a global Mexican standoff. If one guy does the wrong thing, the whole of space goes to pot. So I personally think that we're okay as long as we never allow non-state actors to regulate or police access to space, as long as state-level actors keep control of how space objects get there. I think actually it can be regulated in a good and orderly way.
I'm glad to see you've taken my Wild West metaphor and run with it. General Likori.
Sure. So I wanted to pick up where a couple of the panelists have discussed, but I wanted to start first with the premise of the question. I guess I take a slightly different view. I believe that you started the question by saying that, for whoever submitted, that capability is more important than relationships. And I think of that differently. I think both of those are equal parts of this equation. And with only capability, we're not going to be successful in deterrence in this domain. With only relationships, we won't be either. And so both are equally important. There have been hints of hard power versus soft power. Those are both pieces of this equation. The United States Space Force, our Department of Defense, are active participants with our interagency in some of the UN forums that have been alluded to. And we certainly plan to continue to do those things so that we can focus on the responsible behaviors in the domain and therefore be able to highlight when an actor steps outside of that boundary of responsible behavior, but we do it as an international group as opposed to one particular country. By the same token, we certainly have the responsibility, at least in the United States Space Force, again, to preserve that freedom of action, and so that will require capability. And so we certainly will do those types of things as well. I think all of us that operate in the domain would prefer that conflict does not extend into the domain, no doubt about it. But it would be irresponsible for us to assume that it won't and not prepare for that. And so, really, our chief has talked about a couple times, the only thing worse than a war in space is losing one in space because of all of the things that we've talked about today. And so I think it's equal parts capability and relationship that are critical.
Thank you. And Nick Smith, you wanted to come in on this.
Yeah, if I may, I'll just jump in and offer, just to build on the General's point as well, is talk about, we've already hinted at the economic and the prosperity opportunities in space. That's recognized globally. Every globe is looking for their opportunity to try and generate some prosperity from space and be part of that space. I think the Committee on the Peaceful Utilization of Outer Space now, I think it's the fastest growing non-government body. I think it's now got 95 members. I think there are 80 nations that have space assets. There are 95 members of that committee. I think what that says is there is such a mutual benefit to be gained from the good utilization of space. And as long as industry has a role to play, but as do governments, just to try and incentivize that, rather than be too much on the deterrent side, how can we incentivize that continual benefit that we'll all get globally from space? Then that's another way we can use that soft power to try and maintain the good use of space.
Thank you. And Christina, can I bring you in? Do you have any thoughts to add to this?
Just that I think, like everyone said, that I think the technology is continuing to expand. There's new LEO constellations, for example, being launched and talked about being launched constantly. And I think that's all good. I think all of the technology that we can put in there and working collaboratively together will only improve, the outcomes and the performance. There'll be new improvements constantly. As we said, it is an ever-changing domain. And so it's important that we embrace that and look forward to, how we can utilize those new technologies to enhance what we have and what we're doing today.
I have one question that's come in from the audience, which I think is really relevant. I think it's fair to say it's of particular interest to those of us from the UK. And here's the question. Over the last decade, the UK's space industry has grown massively, with some arguing it's a result of close ties to the European Space Agency and Europe-wide initiatives such as Galileo. So how does the UK become a sovereign space power in a post-Brexit world? Ian, you seem very keen to take that one on.
I think seeing as I had ESA in the title, there is a mix in there. So for every £1 that we currently invest in the European Space Agency, we get the value of 10 of those back. And then you've also got access to a €6 billion kind of workshop of scientists within ESA. And let's not forget, of course, it's separate to the European Union as well. So we can continue to leverage on ESA programs. The balance between, of course, having national space capability, and where you would invest in others, of course, is a very relevant one as well. Kind of we work through that line every day. What's the balance of investment with ESA, and what's the balance of investment we would like to have on national capabilities? Clearly, those that involve national security, you would like to think that they would have sovereignty or assured access or guaranteed access to. Whereas those, of course, from a more commercial perspective, if it's about increasing the economy, pulling in that £15 billion, as I talk about, then you might think that actually getting the collaboration and leverage off of somebody like ESA and those other continental European countries is good value. So I kind of think it's not one or other. I think we just need to look at how we balance the both of them.
Any other final thoughts on this issue? Yes, David.
Thankfully, our ESA relationship is not compromised by Brexit. They're fundamentally unrelated, so we will continue to work with ESA. And I think ESA does some great things in bringing companies together around Europe. I've benefited from it, and I know lots of people that have. But equally, I think it's extremely important that we now have a more robust national programme being developed by Ian. And we also have, I think, more extensive opportunities to work on a Five Eyes partnership basis. So I think our commitment to ESA is really important to us, but I think also expanding our ability to innovate at pace nationally and with Five Eyes partners is just a new and additional opportunity for us.
I would like to say that there's something about this final panel of the day which has been particularly positive for me, because so much of our daily news, so much of our anxiety has been about the pandemic, about thinking about stories that have been dogging us. And this focus on thinking about the future, of thinking about the benefits of space in a positive way, and not just in a defensive way, I think has been a very inspiring place to finish the day's panel discussion. So I'd like to thank all of my panelists internationally for being part of this conversation and sharing their insights. Thank you so much.